hazy time frame regarding the dangerous assault missions these Army Rangers trained for was cleared up in May 1944. A calm, methodical Rudder called us anxious men together in Cornwall and laid out the specific goal of the upcoming D-Day invasion. We were called in not as an individual, but on a very small unit basis and briefed, Ranger Jack Keating recalled. We were taken into this room where they had a map or an overlay. It was like a map that had the beaches outlined, and we were shown exactly where we were going to land, what our job was going to be, and for the first, probably 4 or 5 days after D-Day if you survived. Likewise, Ranger Owen Brown claimed he would never forget the fateful day when the purpose of their grueling training became crystal clear. We had miniature plaster layouts of the French coast, giving the location of beaches, cliffs, and the German defenses, he recalled. They showed us pillboxes, barbed wire, minefields, underwater obstacles. They even told us the composition of the soldiers. There was supposed to be a cadre of Germans with Polish, Russian, and Hungarian men from captured countries working and fighting for the Germans. Rudder, now Lieutenant Colonel, was thrilled that the 2nd Ranger Battalion, comprising 6 companies with 63 men each, was chosen to play such a crucial role in Operation Overlord. The rumors were over. Reality was sinking in. His Rangers would be responsible for climbing the sheer cliffs at Pointe Du Hoc and destroying the menacing Nazi concrete bunkers located 4 miles west of Omaha Beach on the coast of Normandy. The U.S. Army's intelligence branch knew that the Germans had a battery of 6 155mm guns perched on top of the point between Utah and Omaha beaches and positioned to deliver devastating fire on both beaches as well as on naval targets. Their importance was not lost on the Allies, who had Pointe Du Hoc on every target schedule on D-Day. With an estimated firing range of 25,000 yards, about 14 miles, taking out these guns could make the difference as to whether D-Day was a stunning success or a dismal failure. From their jutting crow's nest, the Germans could inflict great damage to the Allies' armada of over 5,000 ships. Hitler had located his 716th Infantry Regiment and 726th Infantry Regiment to safeguard his precious guns. Even though there were only about 125 of them, the Germans wouldn't give them up without a hellacious fight. Stationed behind Pointe Du Hoc, however, were elements of the German 352nd Infantry Division, based near the town of St. Lo. They would, in all probability, quickly rush to the point to thwart the Allied invasion once it commenced. To neutralize these enemy guns, this elite group of about 225 2nd Ranger Battalion volunteers, Rudder's Rangers, had to surprise the enemy by scaling the 100-foot-tall promontory, even while under a barrage of Nazi fire coming from a concrete observation post. It was a daunting assignment. Erwin Rommel, now in command of Atlantic Wall troops, took limited precautions to secure the area, but never believed Eisenhower would strike the point. The other 275 Rangers, companies A, B, and C, would attack elsewhere along the Normandy coast. To make the Rangers' job easier, the U.S. Army 8th and 9th Air Forces would bomb the dickens out of the Pointe Du Hoc area before the invasion began. Pointe Du Hoc was so important that in the months preceding the invasion, aircraft returning from bombing runs to France and Germany were instructed to drop any remaining bombs from their missions on the point rather than in the English Channel, as was customary. The natural fortress was heavily bombed throughout May during daytime hours, and on June 2nd, 3rd, and 4th during both day and night. With some 3,500 aircraft in their arsenal, including P-40s, B-17s, and B-24s, the 9th Air Force was the largest tactical air unit ever assembled. On D-Day proper, the 8th Air Force's B-17s and B-24s were assigned to abuse the Pointe Du Hoc outcrop. Their bomb tonnage created avalanches down the cliff and massive craters on top. At the very least, the thunderous bombardment would send the Nazis scurrying for cover in their underground bunkers. This was welcome news. Help was also being provided by the Royal Air Force's 2nd Tactical Air Forces. But tactical aviation support wasn't a life insurance policy. The Army Air Forces and Royal Air Force bombers couldn't just turn the point into a Leviathan bullseye. Nothing would undermine the invasion plan more than if the Nazis started suspecting, due to the bomb drop ratio, the exact location the Allies would try their invasion. so select German targets were bombed up and down the French coastline from Brittany to Belgium. These Atlantic Wall raids increased in frequency as D-Day neared. The planning staff understood that, while air and naval support could cause great damage, historian Robert W. Black wrote, only men on the ground could ensure control. Over the years, World War II chroniclers like John Keegan, Stephen E. Ambrose, and Martin Gilbert have commented on how difficult an assignment these 225 Rangers were asked to perform at Pointe Du Hoc. They were all combat rookies. They were being asked to go on what was essentially a suicide mission. When General Omar Bradley, in fact, asked Rudder to take on the assignment, the no-nonsense Texan gulped as he said, "Yes, sir." But as they looked at each other, their eyes locked. They both knew the body count would be extraordinarily high. No soldier in my command has ever been wished a more difficult task than that which befell the 34-year-old commander of this Provisional Ranger Force, Bradley wrote in his memoir, A Soldier's Story. Lieutenant Colonel James E. Rudder was to take a force of 200 men, land on a shingled shelf under the face of a 100-foot cliff, scale the cliff, and destroy an enemy battery of coastal guns. The first time Bradley mentioned the mission to Rudder, the Texas colonel deemed it a cruel practical joke. Rudder later told Bradley, "I thought you were trying to scare me." Sometimes human courage is a matter of old-fashioned luck, good fortune, or impulsive response. It's not always an inherent self-evident quality. But in truth, these Rangers live by the maxim made famous by Branch Rickey, general manager of the Brooklyn Dodgers. Luck is the residue of design. Praying wasn't enough to decimate the Nazis. You had to outthink and out-hustle and out-train them every day. While it's true that the most popular refrain of World War II troops would become the self-deprecating, "I was just doing my job," Rangers believed differently. They trained to outperform expectations, particularly during the ferocious helter-skelter of battle. They were unflappable under pressure. It's astonishing that as Jack Keating and Owen Brown, for example, studied maps and models of the Normandy coast and were told that they might be ordered to climb towering cliffs and attempt to destroy a battery of German guns emplaced in reinforced concrete casemates, they didn't go AWOL. Instead of nausea, they greeted the news enthusiastically, eager to liberate Europe. It's not hyperbole, in fact, to claim that their collective courage and love of country was the Homeric kind. The odds of survival had to be, at best, 50-50. Look at it this way. Climbing up the side of El Capitan in Yosemite National Park is a mountaineering feat in its own right. But doing it while the German army is raining machine gun fire and mortar rounds at you would be either insane or Herculean. Take your pick. That all of these Rangers were willing to volunteer for such a deadly mission, no questions asked, is awe-inspiring. As we prepared for the invasion, we were all aware of the dangers, but at least as far as I was concerned, I didn't really think about the danger in a personal way, Ranger Gerald Heaney recalled. It was as if we were so well trained and so well prepared that nothing could stand in our way. With accelerated resoluteness, Rudder began further training his Rangers for the contingencies of the D-Day invasion. On May 6th, a provisional Ranger group was officially formed. It was ordered to attach itself to the 116th Infantry Regiment, 29th Infantry Division. In charge of this Ranger group, including both the 2nd and 5th Battalions, was Colonel Rudder. According to Lieutenant George Kirchner, Company D, Rudder ordered them to climb the most difficult cliffs they could find. Rudder located the ideal ones, the closest in topographical proximity to Pointe Du Hoc, at Swange on the coast of Dorset. Other steep terrain was climbed on the Isle of Wight. The cliffs at Dorset were 200 to 250 feet high. The eager Rangers boarded British LCAs and then stormed the docile cliffs. Veteran British commandos, with combat experience under their belts, helped with the accelerated amphibious training. At Swanage, the Rangers also experimented with a vast array of equipment for escalade, including steel extension ladders. Due to their inherent lightness, rope ladders, however, were the preferred climbing tool. DUKWs, ducks, were also added to the invasion mix. They would land on the shale beach at Pointe Du Hoc, raise a ladder high into the air, and allow Rangers to climb to the top rung, unloading machine gun fire on the unsuspecting Nazi lookouts. It was at Swanage that the 2nd Rangers learned what they were ordered to bring with them on their seaborne assault mission. Because they were going to have to survive for days or even weeks on their own if they reached the top of the cliff, the Rangers were expected, by a March 1, 1944 order, to have the following provisions. Number 1. Individuals in the assault will carry the minimum equipment for the assigned mission. The combat pack will contain only the following: 2 rations, 1 K and 1 D, spoon, 1 suit underwear, 2 pair of socks, 1 raincoat, if not worn, 1 towel, and 1 toilet kit. Second point. Individual rolls containing blankets, shelter halves, and mess kits will be provided as soon as the tactical situation permits and in accordance with administrative order. Third point. All units will carry organic loads of POL, that's petroleum oil lubricants, water, and ammunition insofar as vehicles will permit. 3 days' ration, type C or K, will be taken for emergency, not to be counted in total. Left to their own wits, the Rangers knew they would succeed. Their confidence was that high, or so they feigned. What the Rangers were fearful of, however, as they physically and psychologically prepared to take Pointe Du Hoc, was the hungry artillery the Germans had in place along the Atlantic Wall. The guns of Pointe Du Hoc, ironically, weren't German-made, a fact often overlooked by D-Day scholars. The Nazis had captured these 155mm guns from the French Maginot Line in 1940. The French-designed guns were manufactured to fire 4 rounds per minute with a muzzle velocity of 735 meters per second. History documented that previous English-bound cross-channel invasions, the Normandy conquest for example, would be deemed successful. No soldiers, however, had ever been asked to directly charge enemy guns of such brutal magnitude. Such weapons simply didn't exist in the 16th century, for instance. But make no mistake about it, all of Rudder's Rangers understood their daring high-wire act was something new in the annals of warfare and was absolutely essential if Operation Overlord was to become a military reality and not just a pipe dream of Roosevelt and Churchill. According to Rotman, Rudder's Rangers understood that the German guns' ability to deliver flanking fire on both Omaha and Utah beaches was endangering the D-Day landings. As D-Day approached, the 2nd Ranger Battalion entered its final 7-day course at the Army Assault Training Center in Broughton, Devonshire, a combat simulation facility overlooking Barnstable Bay, where the Phobos 7 full-scale pre-invasion exercises were held. The drills closely approximated what the Rangers could expect at Pointe Du Hoc and Pointe Edraz de la Percée, where Company C would land. There were no German big guns at the latter promontory, located 3 miles east of Pointe Du Hoc, but the Nazi small arms fire was expected to be intense there. For weapons, the Rangers were given everything from bazookas to Bangalore torpedoes and thermite grenades. Single-channel radios were provided. After all, once they landed on the beach and the Germans were shooting at them, communication would be the essential ingredient for ultimate success. And the Rangers were reminded that they would not be alone. Operation Overlord called for over 6,000 naval vessels, including 138 warships to provide cover for the first wave outfits like the 2nd Rangers. Advance intelligence has also reported that the D-Day beaches of Omaha, Utah, Sword, Gold, and Juneau were booby-trapped with landmines and barbed wire. At Broughton, they were taught how to carefully avoid and deactivate such life-threatening obstacles. It was during these springtime drills that the 2nd Rangers learned definitively about their D-Day landing vessels. In the United States, they were designated Landing Craft Vehicle Personnel, or LCVPs, or Higgins boats, after their New Orleans-based shipbuilder, Andrew Jackson Higgins. During World War I, amphibious forces used river barges or old whaling boats for landing craft. If Higgins had not designed and built those LCVPs, we never could have landed over an open beach, Eisenhower believed. The whole strategy of the war would have been different, he said. It wasn't until the late 1930s that Higgins Industries designed LCVPs, which could land men and equipment on a beach. Once the boat was ashore, the troops on board would leap over the side and sprint out via the equipment vehicle ramp. Called by Hitler America's New Noah, Higgins had designed these vessels especially for amphibious assaults. The boat was crafted mostly of plywood. The only metal part was the front ramp door, which served as a barrier against enemy fire and then dropped open. Holding up to 36 men, these tough and adaptable boats could operate in less than 2 feet of water, and their curved fronts and guarded rear propellers allowed them to pull onto land and still be able to maneuver back out to sea. By September 1943, 12,964 of the U.S. Navy's 14,072 vessels had been designed by Higgins in the warehouse behind his St. Charles Avenue showroom, meaning that 92% of the Navy was a Higgins Navy. The 2nd Ranger Battalion, however, would use a slight variation of the Higgins boats for their D-Day landing. Because the Rangers had been in Great Britain for nearly 6 months and had trained with commandos, they had grown accustomed to practicing assault maneuvers in 41-foot-long landing craft, assault boats, the British equivalent of a Higgins boat. Both models featured lowering ramps and had 2 engines. The only real design differences between the British LCA and the American Higgins boat were gunnels and light armor on the sides of the former. That made the LCA slower and heavier, historian Stephen Ambrose wrote in his book D-Day, which meant that the LCA rode lower in the water than the LCVP. It would take 10 British LCAs, fully equipped with 3 pairs of rocket mounts, to carry companies D, E, and F to the narrow beach in front of Pointe Du Hoc. Like the LCVPs, the LCAs could carry up to 35 men. They were, however, too flimsy to effectively transport vehicles. As vessels go, the LCAs were quite silent, designed to beach without revealing their positions because of noise. More than 480 British LCAs were deployed on D-Day. The great innovation, the one that made the liberation of Pointe Du Hoc possible, however, was not LCAs. It was a new mountaineering device. Fastened on the front of select landing craft headed toward Pointe Du Hoc would be a specially designed rocket containing a grappling hook with ropes connected to it. When the LCAs hit shore, these rockets would be discharged straight into the cliff. According to the strategic plan, the fired grappling hooks, an iron shaft with claws at one end used for grasping or holding, would penetrate into the point. This would allow the U.S. Rangers to climb up the rope ladders that dangled down to the beach. Out of all the first-person accounts about the boys of Pointe Du Hoc, the most detailed was an article written shortly after D-Day by Lieutenant G.K. Hodenfield that appeared in the Saturday Evening Post on August 19, 1944. A writer for Stars and Stripes, Hodenfield understood that Pointe Du Hoc was target number 1 and wanted to cover the action. He had joined the 2nd Ranger Battalion only 3 days before Operation Overlord commenced. He quickly learned that the rope ladders with grappling hooks, which were to be fired over the cliffs by rockets, were the secret weapon of the assault. The grapnels were to bite into the bomb-blasted earth of Pointe Du Hoc, and when the slack was taken up, the ladders would be ready to climb, he explained to readers. The entire success of this operation depended on those ladders. Pointe Du Hoc is accessible from the sea only by scaling the cliffs, and the Germans, believing that not even military idiots would dare to come from that direction, had placed all their defenses facing inland. The Pointe Du Hoc headland is a remarkable natural and strategic spot. It jabs into the English Channel like a cursed dagger. But to be successful, the attack of the U.S. Army Rangers 2nd Battalion on the point's overhanging cliffs had to rely upon the essential element of complete surprise. As Hodenfield noted, it was reasonable to presume that German defenders would not expect a Ranger battalion to attempt to scale the cliffs. After all, not even Rommel could have envisioned grappling hooks fired from special mortars installed on a fleet of newfangled landing craft. It was precisely because the Nazis would not anticipate such a bizarre invasion strategy that Supreme Allied Commander Eisenhower planned it. A plausible but high-risk military gambit with everything at stake. The Allies were invading a continent where the enemy had immense capabilities for reinforcement and counterattack, not a small island cut off by sea power from sources of supply, U.S. naval historian Samuel Eliot Morison wrote in The Invasion of France and Germany 1944 to 1945. Even a complete pulverizing of the Atlantic Wall at Omaha would have availed nothing if the German command had been given 24 hours' notice to move up reserves for counterattack. We had to accept the risk of heavy casualties on the beaches to prevent far heavier ones on the plateau and among the hedgerows. As D-Day approached, Colonel Rudder, like all of his Rangers, turned introspective. With death an imminent possibility, after-dinner hours were consumed by writing heartfelt correspondence to loved ones. For security reasons, no mention of D-Day was allowed in these missives. Reading dozens of them decades later, one realizes that most of the Rangers wanted to remind family and friends that they were all right, that life was good and precious, and in their cases, possibly short. On June 1st, for example, just 5 days before D-Day, Rudder wrote his wife Margaret and his children an upbeat, sweet note meant to show both parental concern and inner strength. Shortly after composing it, he ordered his Rangers to board their transport vessels, which would wait in the devilish English Channel until they were ordered to strike France. "My darling wife and kids," the letter began. "About now you are depositing Bud and Liz with Jewel, and you are greatly excited over your trip to San Antonio tomorrow. Bud, you, and Liz are getting set to have lots of fun playing with Billy and Lucille, while Mommy shows the damn Yankee the sights of Texas. I am equal pleased with my immediate future, and that is kicking the pants off those so-and-sos that has separated me from the three persons that are most dear to me. We are really ready for the job. No one has ever had the privilege of leading a finer bunch of men and officers into battle than I will have. Tell Alice she can well be proud of the captain. He did a splendid job for me as adjutant and is doing equally as well in his present job. I'm depending on him a great deal in the task ahead of us. But, old pal, I've been looking at your pictures that Smitty made of you, Liz, and Mommy, and I must say Liz rather beat you in posing for pictures for her daddy. You surely aren't afraid to have your picture made, are you? Old pal, you must always be big and brave and do the things just as your mother wants you. Liz, you certainly were sweet in your little blue dress. Is it the one bought for you? Bud, you were quite a sport in your striped coat. Honey, the thinness of your face and neck gives me much concern. I do hope you are well and are putting on some weight. Remember, our goal has only been halfway reached. I want you to be in fit condition to get on with the job next summer when I return. Hold on to your help and don't let the snobs of Brady get her away from you. My darling, you are more high-powered than either of the ones you mentioned, so stay with them. Give Alice my love, and you two have enough fun for the captain and myself. Good night, old pal, Daddy's baby, and my darling. All my love, Earl." Colonel Rudder wasn't the only officer taking pen to paper in the countdown hours before D-Day. General Eisenhower, besides writing his wife, Mamie, sent this message to all Americans participating in the D-Day invasion of Normandy. "Soldiers, sailors, and airmen of the Allied Expeditionary Force, you are about to embark upon the great crusade towards which we have striven these many months. The eyes of the world are upon you. The hopes and prayers of liberty-loving people everywhere march with you. In company with our brave allies and brothers in arms on other fronts, you will bring about the destruction of the German war machine, the elimination of Nazi tyranny over the oppressed peoples of Europe, and security for ourselves in a free world. Your task will not be an easy one. Your enemy is well-trained, well-equipped, and battle-hardened. He will fight savagely. But this is the year 1944. Much has happened since the Nazi triumphs of 1940 and 41. The United Nations have inflicted upon the Germans great defeats in open battle, man to man. Our air offensive has seriously reduced their strength in the air and their capacity to wage war on the ground. Our home fronts have given us an overwhelming superiority in weapons and munitions of war, and placed at our disposal great reserves of trained fighting men. The tide has turned. The freemen of the world are marching together to victory. I have full confidence in your courage, devotion to duty, and skill in battle. We will accept nothing less than full victory. Good luck, and let us all beseech the blessing of Almighty God upon this great and noble undertaking. Dwight Eisenhower. Besides having commanding officers pass out this morale-boosting message, Eisenhower wanted it airdropped and handed out all over Europe. Just about every U.S. soldier in the European theater eventually read this one-page flyer. Another urgent message Eisenhower wrote, however, which none of the D-Day soldiers got to read, was a top-secret June 5th statement in which he took full personal responsibility for the D-Day invasion if it was a disaster. During the days before D-Day, Eisenhower kept it in his wallet. Our landings in the Cherbourg-Havre area have failed to gain a satisfactory foothold, and I have withdrawn the troops, he wrote. My decision to attack at this time and place was based upon the best information available. The troops, the air, and the Navy did all that bravery and devotion to duty could do. If any blame or fault attaches to the attempt, it is mine alone. Although Colonel Rudder had never issued such a defeatist message, he was, like General Eisenhower, ready to take full blame for whatever went wrong at Pointe Du Hoc. Like any good commanding officer, Rudder considered the 225 Rangers he helped train in Tennessee, Florida, New Jersey, and Great Britain to be his extended family. Together they would fight, win, lose, or draw, united in unflinching purpose. Chapter 3. Climbing the Cliffs, Destroying the Guns. Once Colonel James E. Rudder mailed his letter home on June 1st, he ordered Companies D, E, and F, then at Marshalling Area D5 in Dorchester, England, to board their British transports, HMS Ben Macri and Amsterdam. Meanwhile, Companies A, B, and C were ordered onto the Prince Charles. Their main port of debarkation was Weymouth. As the Rangers boarded their transports, their primary concern was eluding the German Luftwaffe, whose planes were constantly buzzing over the Dorchester area, taking reconnaissance photographs, and sometimes dropping bombs. The men in Companies D, E, and F were now part of a 10 LCA-strong team called Task Force A, who were to capture Pointe Du Hoc at H hour, 6:30 a.m. on D-Day, then scheduled for June 5th. But, of course, poor weather caused a postponement until June 6th. The stakes were high. All of the 2nd Rangers looked at each other as if death were at their doorsteps. But that was only for a flash second or two. Somehow, due to the combination of training and prayer, they collectively conjured up the courage to match Eisenhower's words, to tell themselves, "Okay, let's go." Indecision was now an impossibility. Many of the 2nd Rangers who boarded the transports were sick. The culprit was food poisoning from a potful of contaminated hot dogs. It was bad enough having to contend with one's nerves before battle. Now the food which they had been served was rancid, Joanna MacDonald recounted in the liberation of Pointe Du Hoc. The whole battalion was laid low, and many began to doubt if they could go ahead with their mission. Some even suspected that their food had been tampered with. Sitting aboard their transport ships, waiting for General Dwight D. Eisenhower's golden word, go, the Rangers whittled away time. They played low-stakes poker, sang Tin Pan Alley songs, and sipped Irish whiskey. A ukulele was passed around, although nobody strummed it well. A few preferred to quietly play bridge. Cigarettes were chain-smoked. Sleep was hard to come by while in limbo. Mandatory intelligence briefings offered little new information about the status of the German guns, but they were a diversion from the wait. Pocket maps in the Norman countryside were studied carefully, as if the Rangers were young surveyors for National Geographic. Weighed down with equipment, they tried on gas masks and made sure they had an orange diamond Ranger decal on the backs of their steel helmets. On their left upper sleeves were their hard-earned Ranger patches. While all the men were comfortable in their green infantry pants, their jackets were a different story entirely. As a precaution against German blister gas, the jackets had been laced with a protective chemical, one that made them feel awkward to move around in. They were dressed in fatigue uniforms, carrying 2 grenades each, with an M1 rifle slung over their shoulders. Each of the 3 Ranger companies in Task Force A carried with it a couple of light mortars and special thermite grenades to be used once on top of Pointe Du Hoc. Blowing up German pillboxes and big guns was, after all, their main mission. A civilian soaking up the pre-invasion atmosphere inside the Ben Macri, Amsterdam, and Prince Charles would have thought he or she had entered floating ammo depots. Everywhere one looked were Tommy guns, Browning automatic rifles, and buckets full of grenades. Young men who should have been dating girls or playing college football paced around the tight vessel quarters with rounds of ammunition crossing both shoulders and forming an ominous X across their chest. Because all the officers and most of the enlisted men were wearing paratrooper boots, the floor constantly rumbled. Sergeant Frank South, headquarters company, spent his pre-evasion hours packing plasma, suture material, sulfa-based antibiotics, and other medical supplies that would be essential once the heavy fighting commenced. A Nebraska native, he learned how to be a medic when assigned to the 106th Division. Father Joe Lacey, a rotund, happy-go-lucky Catholic priest, held prayer sessions as the fateful invasion hour neared. One of the things that I remember him saying to all of us on D-Day, at least to the people aboard the ship, that always stuck in my mind, Lieutenant George Kirchner recalled, was when he said, "When you land on the beach and you get in there, I don't want to see anybody kneeling down and praying. If I do, I'm going to come up and boot you in the tail. You leave the praying to me, and you do the fighting." Within a few days, however, the long wait was over. Shortly before 4 a.m. on June 6, the intercom of the 3 transport ships suddenly blared, "Rangers, man your craft." That was it. D-Day was upon them. Bad weather be damned, General Eisenhower, at 0330 hours on June 5th, had decided the weather was now in their favor. He green-lighted Operation Overlord by shouting, "Okay, let's go." With those 3 simple words, the largest seaborne attack in history, over 100,000 U.S., British, and Canadian soldiers strong, was about to commence. All 225 of the 2nd Ranger Battalion's companies D, E, and F washed off sleep and checked their equipment. Those not too seasick or food poisoned gulped down pancakes, guzzled citrus drinks, and quietly walked onto the waiting LCAs, manned by British sailors, which would be lowered into the channel once they were full of combat-ready Rangers. "All aboard the Hoboken ferry," one of the men famously shouted. This brought about a round of hearty, spontaneous laughter, but nervousness was unmistakably in the air. The approximately 275 men of Companies A, B, and C were likewise jarred awake on the Prince Charles. They too breakfasted, and then boarded the small fleet of LCAs. Each LCA carried about 35 men. A purplish, misty dawn was upon the Rangers when, after the transport sailed most of the way across the channel, their LCAs were dropped into the turbulent waters. They headed straight for the Norman coast as soft light was emerging out of the darkness. The dark blue-gray water was cold. Waves ranged from 2 to 4 feet. If you fell overboard, hypothermia was almost guaranteed. A cutting breeze had put a real sting in the air. Patches of low-lying clouds mildly obstructed vision. Everything was damp, dismal, and dreary. A minute in the English Channel that morning on an LCA seemed like an hour. You could almost hear the seconds tick. The objective for the day for Companies D, E, and F was straightforward enough. Destroy the 6 155mm German guns with a 14-mile range and placed in reinforced concrete casemates at Pointe Du Hoc. But in warfare, objectives can change every 2 or 3 minutes. The important thing was to be hyper-alert. Daydreaming was a sure avenue to death. The Rangers of Company C, 3 officers and 65 men, were the first to disembark from the Prince Charles, and LCAs headed straight into Pointe de la Perse. British sailors helped these Rangers into the landing craft, which were hanging and swaying in the davits. They were 10 miles away from the French coast. Unlike the Higgins boats, which were first lowered in the water and then loaded, the British LCAs were crammed with the soldiers before the boats were lowered into the choppy water. Down went the landing craft in the davits, remembered Lieutenant Sidney Solomon, one of the platoon commanders. All conversation had come to a halt, as if everyone had suddenly become mute. All were tense. Now a loud smack as the bottom of the landing craft hit the water. The first landing craft away from the transport began a circle, waiting for the second craft to maneuver into position. When both were in their assigned positions, the parallel trip in the direction of the shore began. We were 2 small bobbing objects in the choppy waters of the channel. A terrible omen occurred only a few minutes after all the LCAs were dropped into the water. Assault craft LCA 860, due to either poor engineering or too much weight, overturned. Captain Harold Duke Slater and 25 of his men from Company D, all loaded down with heavy equipment, started sinking to the bottom of the English Channel. They tried to rip off boots and backpacks, anything that would enhance their ability to float to the surface. 4 men drowned, and the others were rushed back to an English hospital after their rescue. This fiasco eliminated more than 1/3 of the 65-man force of Company D. LCA 914, a supply craft, also sunk, killing most of the men. Suddenly, the 225 men of Pointe Du Hoc numbered closer to 180. There was nothing we could do to help those poor guys, just say a little prayer that they would be picked up before they froze to death, a Stars and Stripes reporter writing with the Rangers wrote. We all wanted to help, but the success of our mission was too vital, and the Rangers knew they were expendable. The men on other LCAs experiencing serious leaks had to start bailing their vessels by using their combat helmets as buckets. Their teeth chattering in the cold, the Rangers on the still seaworthy LCAs let out a collective gasp of despair when they discovered an even more serious problem. The all-important climbing ropes were soaked, and the weight of the water would mean that the rockets firing the grappling hooks wouldn't hit as high into the cliffs. The debacle of the infamous Dieppe raid flashed through some of the Rangers' minds as they huddled together in the LCAs like nervous cattle jammed inside a large phone booth. Years later, these moments aboard the LCAs conjured in the surviving Rangers the most tears. They had already watched helplessly as friends drowned, engulfed by the hungry sea, and now they contemplated that the waterlogged ropes made reaching the cliff tops an even more difficult proposition. No matter how many oral histories are collected about Rudder's Rangers, it's still impossible to know precisely what each man felt as they crossed the English Channel. There was not one set of war experiences from that day. Memory is episodic, and details are easily forgotten. Every man crowded onto those LCAs, however, was pumped up, adrenaline coursing through his veins. Some men recalled daydreaming about family back in Ohio, New Jersey, or Pennsylvania. Others remembered seasickness, raging sweats, or a counting of rosary beads. Jokes were a welcome relief. Compulsively recleaning weapons was commonplace. To break up the nervousness and keep morale high, First Sergeant Len Lamel, Company D, started placing $100 bets on which LCA crew would be the first up the cliffs. Most of the Rangers, like Lieutenant James Eichner of Mississippi, preferred decades later to simply recall their collective grace under fire. When we went into battle after all this training, there was no shaking of the knees or weeping or praying, Eichner matter-of-factly noted. We knew what we were getting into. We knew every one of us had volunteered for extra hazardous duty. We went into battle confident. We were intent on getting the job done. We were actually looking forward to accomplishing our mission. Donald Scribner from Company C was on the Prince Charles. His unit's specific mission was to climb the cliffs of Pointe de la Perse, located 3 miles east of Pointe Du Hoc. The C Company, isolated from the rest of the 2nd Battalion Force, bravely fought the bewitching tidal current, praying they wouldn't sink. I remember quite well going across the English Channel, he later recalled. It was very rough. The waves were very high. We were about 10 miles from shore when Colonel Rudder came down and talked to us prior to loading up the LCAs. He had this comment to make to us. Boys, you are going on the beach as the first Rangers in this combat and this battalion to set foot on French soil, but don't worry about being alone. When D, E, and F take care of Pointe Du Hoc, we'll come down and give you a hand with your objective. Good luck, and may God be with you. Decades later, Scribner reminisced about what it was like for Company C as they approached Pointe de la Perse from the channel like torpedoes heading directly into shore. Suddenly, there were splashes around the craft, and white, cascading water, he recalled. Then concentric circles as shells landed in the water in the vicinity of the landing craft. Sharp pings of bullets against the steel hull sounded as defending Germans fired their automatic weapons directly at the landing craft. Instinctively, the Rangers crouched low in the LCAs and the coxswain propelled the throttle forward. The torrent of bullet pings on the hull, however, continued unabated. I called out the words "Get ready," which were passed along to those in the stern of the craft, and everyone inched forward just a little bit, Scribner recalled. The moment the ramp had dropped down, automatic weapons and rifle fire sprayed the debarking Rangers, killing and wounding several men. The second man was hit by a bullet from a German entrenched at the top of the cliff. I reached over and pulled him clear of the craft just before the heavy still-hold craft would have steamrolled him. The Rangers waded into the shoreline and started across the sand, striving to reach the cover of the base of the cliff. Machine guns, small arms fire, and mortars cut down some of the men as they attempted to run across the sand. Quickly, the men of Company C gathered at the base of the cliff and returned fire, hoping to pick off the German snipers ensconced above. Captain Ralph Goranson, the company commander, ordered the Rangers up the ropes. Lieutenant William P. Moody, along with Sergeant Julius Belcher of Stewart's Creek, Virginia, and Otto Stevens of Newcastle, Indiana, scaled the cliffs, Goranson recalled. These three men free-climbed about a 90-foot cliff that was partially an incline and then straight up the last 15 or 20 feet. We gave them covering fire from down below to keep the Germans off their back. The last 10 or 15 feet, they chinned themselves up with their trench knives and secured a series of toggle ropes from the barbed wire emplacement up there so the rest of us could immediately move over into this position and climb up the cliff and get into the area around the fortified houses. Lieutenant Moody, immediately when he got topside, killed the officer in charge of the Germans in the fortified house. We found the rest of the area honeycombed with dugouts, trench systems. And immediately Lieutenant Moody and his men dispatched teams to go and clear up this area. They were followed immediately by the 2nd Platoon with Lieutenant Solomon, and it was right here that we lost Lieutenant Moody. He was down by a sniper. That left Lieutenant Solomon to lead the forces up the gnarly cliffs of Pointe Arras de la Perse. Once atop, he ordered Rangers in groups of 2s and 3s to capture the snake-like German trenches and dugout holes. With great caution, the Rangers then surrounded the fortified house at the top of the cliff that was the nerve center of the Nazi base camp. This was put out of action by Sergeant Belcher, who threw in a white phosphorus grenade, remembered Captain Gorson. And when the Germans came out, they were sent to heaven by Sergeant Belcher's gun. Every Ranger interviewed over the years has vivid memories of German hand grenades and machine gun fire. Ultimately, I made it to the top and spotted a series of trenches some 25 yards distant, Solomon went on in his oral history. I pointed, indicating all should run to the trench. We all ran and leaped in the trench, fully prepared to take sole possession, and opposition from the foe soon ended, and I looked around to see who was still with me. 9 remained from the 39 that had been jammed in the landing craft. While Company C attacked Pointe Arras de la Perse, the small flotilla of 9 LCAs with Companies D, E, and F navigated the heavy seas, headed directly to Pointe Du Hoc Beach. For these companies, the now celebrated boys of Pointe Du Hoc, things continued going terribly wrong. As the LCAs approached the coast, Colonel Rudder noticed that the promontory to which they were headed was not Pointe Du Hoc, but Pointe Arras de la Perse, where Company C was already engaging the Nazis. The swift current had sent them off course, about 3 miles east of Pointe Du Hoc. Rudder quickly had the helmsman of LCA 888 turn right 90 degrees to head parallel to the coast, running a gauntlet of German small arms fire. Earl always believed if they had hit the beach on time, they could have taken Pointe Du Hoc without firing a shot, Rudder's wife Margaret later noted. But no matter how much went wrong, he and his men still succeeded. The other LCAs followed Rudder's lead vessel in a straight line, approximately 200 yards off the Norman shore. They were in a difficult but not hopeless situation. The important thing was not to panic. The good news was that the British destroyer Talabant and the American destroyer Sadr Lee were still firing away at the surprised Nazi lookouts. I can remember when the first small arms hit our boat and it made a noise and somebody said what it was, Eckner recalled. I looked and there was a little round hole through one of the rope boxes and I said, "My God, these guys are playing for keeps." And so we all got down. We had been standing up except for those who were bailing water, so we all ducked down. The Germans were taking us under fire like shooting ducks in a tub, and it got worse as we got closer to the point. Suddenly, seeing the promontory they had studied in reconnaissance photographs looming in front of them like Oz, a surreal rocky outcropping from which German artillery was being fired directly at their vessels, caused the most even-keeled Rangers to gulp. Contained anxiety spread. They weren't being asked to merely climb the cliff. It fell upon them to take the mountain, so to speak. Each man hoped, and many prayed, that U.S. Army Air Forces and Royal Air Force planes had been bombing the daylights out of the Atlantic Wall. Second-hand reports were that their hundreds of sorties had been highly successful. But who knew for sure? At least the billowing clouds of smoke rising above the coastline were testimony that something had been hit. Maybe the German guns had already been taken out. Maybe not. The British coxswain's navigation blunder caused a 30 to 45-minute delay in getting to Pointe Du Hoc. By the time Rudder detected the error, precious time had been wasted, and his men were under fire as they ran parallel to the shore. The narrow window to signal for the offshore force to follow had almost expired. Time was of the essence. As 9 LCAs, numbered 668, 722, 858, 861, 862, 883, 884, 887, and 888, approached the east side of Pointe Du Hoc under a small arms barrage, the Rangers of Companies D, E, and F were poised to attack. If the Rangers got control of the point, 2 specially loaded backup LCAs would land on the beach with extra rations, mortars, and equipment. Then the other 2 Ranger companies, A and B, along with the entire 5th Battalion, would follow them ashore. These backup Rangers went offshore marking time, waiting to attack the point. If the attack failed, or if the success signal did not come in time, they would go to nearby Omaha Beach and march up the Vierville Draw to the coast highway, attacking German fortifications at Point Arras de la Percée, and then move against Pointe Du Hoc from the rear. The secondary objective, after the coastal guns were decommissioned, was to cut the road running behind Pointe Du Hoc from Oistrom to Grand Camp. If their comrades at Pointe Du Hoc had succeeded, then the Rangers from Omaha Beach would link up, historian Jonathan Bastable explained in Voices from D-Day. If they had failed, then the Omaha Rangers would attempt to capture the big guns from the landward side. So there were 3 separate chances to take the 6 great guns out of the battle: the bombardment from the air, the assault from the sea, and the smash-and-grab raid across the land. Bastable's explanation is wrong in part. He suggests that the original plan was for a Ranger landing in Omaha Beach. That was to take place only if the attack at the point failed or had not succeeded in the time allowed. The original plan was for all the Rangers to assault up the cliffs. As Rudder's Rangers approached Pointe Du Hoc, firing their grappling ropes into the cliffs, the battleship Texas constantly roared rounds of 14-inch shells at the perched enemy forces. The explosions were deafening. The Texas was one of the most illustrious battleships of World War II. Even before Pearl Harbor, the vessel had received the first commercial radar in the U.S. Navy, followed by brand-new anti-aircraft batteries and radio equipment. The venerable Texas had participated in World War I and was considered old in 1944, yet its new on-deck technology caused it to be designated the flagship of the U.S. Atlantic Fleet. Throughout World War II, numerous German submarines tried to torpedo the Texas but were unsuccessful. And it was the Texas, providing gunfire support for the assault on Morocco, that dropped off the 26-year-old war correspondent Walter Cronkite as he began his assignment for CBS. Decades later, almost all the men of the 2nd Ranger Battalion speak of the withering fire of the Texas in near reverential tones. When they were storming the cliffs of Pointe Du Hoc, the Texas was blasting away at the German defenses with its 10 14-inch guns positioned in 5 turrets. The battleship USS Statter Lee and HMS Taliban were the best friends the U.S. Army Ranger 2nd Battalion had. There was, however, one downside of this naval support, and it was a big one. As the Rangers landed on the 500-yard-long, 30-yard-wide beach in front of Pointe Du Hoc, they were catching gunfire from both sides. In addition, some Rangers were killed or wounded from friendly fire. Surviving Rangers tell of dead on the beach, some missing limbs made lifeless in seconds by beach obstacles and raining German bullets. Lieutenant George Kirchner, Company D, later recalled the terrifying sound the 14-inch guns of the Texas made. Of course, they were passing far over our heads, but we were close enough to hear and feel some of the muzzle blasts, Kirchner said. I recall as we got perhaps halfway in, one of the rocket-firing craft that was off of Omaha Beach fired their rockets. There was also a terrifying thing, I think there were 1,000 or more rockets on these landing craft, and they fired in salvos of maybe 10 or 15 at a time. It was just one continuous sheet of fire going up from this rocket-firing craft. I remember wondering, how could anybody really live on the beaches with all this fire that was landing there? Company E's Salvo Mamone remembers how his experience on his transport ship came flashing back into his mind as his LCA's ramp opened and he stormed the cliff, the rockets having already fired the ropes. On the boat, we had a little conference with the officers telling us how dangerous this mission was. We were facing great odds. The way they put it to you, with the odds you had there, it was as if you were ready to go to an electric chair because you didn't have any chance. And it had you feeling tight all the time you were on the boat. To try to forget about it, we played cards and tried to forget everything. But it went on, and men were laughing and carrying on. The officer said everyone that even gets close to the cliff ought to get an award. As the Rangers waded ashore at Pointe Du Hoc, the logistical dilemmas caused by the delay were obvious. For one, the tide was quite high, and if the equipment-heavy Rangers didn't climb immediately, they would drown. My buddy, Paul French, he would not put the strap on the back of his head or under his chin to hold his steel helmet on, Frank South recalled about the crucial minutes when the Rangers were trying to make the beach. And coming in the water, a wave would hit the back of his head and knock his helmet off. So he'd hand his rifle to me, and then he'd start walking almost underwater, looking for his steel helmet again. This happened 4 or 5 times. That's the funny part about it. Not at the time. The Germans manning the guns at the point had been stunned to wake up and see the vast Allied flotilla in the English Channel. Overwhelmed by the magnitude of the invasion, they all, nevertheless, pulled themselves together to fight back. They weren't cowards. The Nazis engaged the Rangers with a fusillade of fire. They quickly tried to cut the Rangers' ropes without making themselves easy targets in the process. Colonel Rudder, setting a fearless example for his men, was on the first LCA to land. He was followed by 16 men from Company E, 4 from Headquarters Company, and his radio operator. He raced to the cliff and established a small headquarters in a cave. As the Rangers sprinted from LCA to cliff, a phalanx of bullets danced in front of them on the beach. Shingles went flying madly in all directions. There was little or no sand on Pointe Du Hoc Beach. Once at the cliff base, the equipment-heavy Rangers tugged on the dangling rope ladders to make sure the grapples had taken hold. The tide was coming in real fast. Salvo Mamone recalled, so as we were getting up the cliff, the Germans were throwing grenades down the cliff. Potato mashers are what they're called, concussion grenades, and different machine gun fire from the beach flank. But we were so close to the Pointe Du Hoc cliff and under it that we took good cover, so we started going up the cliff. The Rangers, lucky enough to have made it to Rudder's cave, now took a deep breath, then started climbing. The difficulty, even the insanity of their mission was more apparent than ever. Sergeant Eugene Elder of F Company had grown up in the Midwest, drifting between homes in Missouri, Iowa, and Kansas. Drafted into the Army in July 1941, Elder had trained in the scorching heat of the Mojave Desert before becoming a Ranger. Now he commanded F Company's mortar squad. In an Eisenhower Center oral history, Elder recalls clinging to the cliffs, shouting out to his men, "Boys, keep your heads down, because headquarters is fouled up again and has issued the enemy live ammunition." Scattered all around these huddled, cliff-clinging Rangers, pausing in the shadows, were grim early signs of deadly destruction. The Allied bombers that had tried to soften the area had knocked rock boulders off the side of the cliff. Avalanche was a new worry they hadn't really trained for. Everything looked wrong and eerie. Badly wounded men were yelling out in agony for help, like in a scene from The Red Badge of Courage. Some scholars, like Ambrose and Drez, claim that the Allies dropped 10 kilotons of high explosives on the Pointe Du Hoc area, the rough equivalent of the Little Boy bomb dropped on Hiroshima. Pointe Du Hoc hadn't just been softened by Allied bombing, it had been pummeled. The enemy had time enough to get out of those underground bunkers and shake his head, clear his brain, and take us under fire, James Eichner recalled. Fortunately, there was a small flotilla of destroyers about, and also the old battleship Texas had participated in the shelling prior to our landing. Of course, Eichner went on, the Air Force and the Navy bombed and shelled the Pointe Du Hoc prior to our arriving, but things had been timed so that the shelling and bombing would be letting up just as we were touching down at 6:30. Well, being 40 minutes late, you could see that the enemy was up and about. A panoramic photograph of the beach in front of Pointe Du Hoc on June 6 seems to show an apocalyptic wasteland or a moonscape on fire. Back in training at Pointe Butte in Cornwall, the Rangers would not have been able to imagine such carnage. The Norman topography that they had studied on maps and models now seemed phony, futilely one-dimensional. Mayhem knew no longitudinal confines. The combination of loud, booming noises coming from all directions added to the symphony of weird madness. Medic Frank South later recalled the difficult task he had of aiding the fallen first wave of D-Day invaders. F Company landed on the left flank of the landing area below the cliffs. South is quoted as saying in Patrick K. O'Donnell's Beyond Valor, World War II's Ranger and airborne veterans reveal the heart of combat. The LCA I was on got our grapnel rockets off in good order, but high on our left flank was a machine gun nest that was in a superb enfilading position. We could not find it until later. We were caught in its field of fire. The LCA to our left came in so close that their rockets would have hit the side of the cliff instead of on top. Sergeant John Cripps dismounted the rockets from the boat and brought them in so they could be fired at a higher angle. This required that they be individually hand-fired using a hot box. Since he was under almost constant machine gun fire, this took enormous self-control and concentration, but Cripps was able to successfully put the grapnel hooks up over the lip of the cliff. As my LCA 884 landed, I still had a huge pack on my back to get ashore. I was aft in the landing craft, for good reason because we had to get the rockets fired, the lines up, and the climbers off first. We were under constant fire at this time, and my pack was so large it got in my way. As the others jumped off the ramp, the bow of the boat raised, and the boat shifted slightly. When I jumped off, I found myself in a shallow, at the time it felt very deep, shell hole, bent double so that my head was immersed. I realized that I well might be beamed by the ramp if it lifted in the swell and came down on me. I slipped the pack off and scrambled onto the beach. Reaching back, I managed to grab the monster and drag it in after me. The next thing I know, someone yelled, "Medic!" A guy off to my left had been hit in the chest. At this time, a number of people were getting hit by small arms, machine gun fire, and grenades. Back when the Rangers had been training at Camp Forest in Tennessee, Rudder had preached the gospel of initiative. That mantra now more than ever became Companies D, E, and F's guiding principle. Up against the cliff wall, looking directly up at the enemy rat-tat-tatting away with machine guns, they were forced into instant reaction mode. The rockets with the grapnels attached were fired, bringing up the climbing lines and ropes, South reminisced. Many fell short because they were fired too soon or because the ropes were wet and heavy. The grapples were designed to go to the top of the cliffs, dig in there, and then we would be able to scale the cliffs using either rope ladders, which some of them had, or simply straight ropes, which most of us preferred. Another equipment setback the Rangers encountered was that the DUKWs, or ducks, were unable to land. With the high tide and cratered beach and relentless enemy fire, they were forced to stay in the channel. The 4 ducks had been equipped with extension ladders from the London Fire Brigade. One had sunk on the run in, and 2 of the others could not reach the narrow land. But the 4th edged forward and now lifted its ladder vertically and inched in toward the sky. We had what the Army called ducks. There are amphibious jeeps, Corporal Lewis Lisco of Pennsylvania, who was wounded and earned a Purple Heart that day, explained. And there were fireman ladders mounted on these ducks, and there was a ranger on top of one, and there were extension ladders that you turned on the motor. This ladder started moving up to the top of the cliff, and this ranger on the top had 2 British twin Lewis machine guns there. He was supposed to go up slowly, and if there were Germans on the edge of the cliff, he was supposed to fire on them. He had an armored panel underneath him to keep him from getting hit by bullets as the ladder was coming up. But because of the bomb craters in the beach and in the water, the ducks were useless. On top of the wobbly duck ladder was Staff Sergeant William Stivison, bobbing and weaving with the pitch and the roll of the craft while manning the twin Lewis machine guns mounted on the top. As he came almost even with the level of the plateau, 90 feet in the air, he blazed away while the ladder swayed in midair. Stuyvesant sprayed the top of Pointe Du Hoc with fire while the Germans dived for cover. A few Nazis managed to fire back, but were unable to kill the elusive Sergeant Stuyvesant as he swayed back and forth, blasting away. Enemy tracers whizzed past Stuyvesant. Again, many came close, but none hit their mark. The aerial firefight lasted for a couple of minutes. Eventually, Stuyvesant had to call it quits. Unable to win over the wind, Stuyvesant had to be lowered back to the Duck. His gallant attempt to eradicate the enemy had failed. So with no meaningful Duck support, waterlogged ropes, time delays, and an entrenched enemy, the Rangers started to climb. My thought was that this whole thing is a big mistake, Lieutenant George Kirchner recalled, that none of us were ever going to get up that cliff. But the boys of Pointe Du Hoc, inch by inch, step by step, breath by breath, continued their ascent. How? A few LCA grappling hooks had penetrated the cliff. They were the Rangers' avenue to the top. Rangers watched with sinking hearts as the grapnels arched in toward the cliff, only to fall short from the weight of the ropes, Ambrose wrote in D-Day. Still, at least one grapnel and rope from each LCA made it. The grapnels grabbed the earth, and the dangling ropes provided a way to climb the cliff. The plan had been for Companies E and F to land on the left side of the point while Company D landed to the right. The delay in the approach, however, changed this strategy. First Sergeant Lem Lamel had eyed an opening between the boats of E and F and ordered the remaining 2 surviving boats of Company D into the narrow gravel beach. The 9 landing craft had a total of 48 mortar tubes to fire the grapnels at the top of the cliff. As each boat had come ashore, it had fired its grappling hooks, but only around 20 made it to the top. Still, it was enough. As the Rangers climbed, the Germans lobbed grenades down at them and tried to cut the ropes with knives. The ramp goes down, Lamel recalled. I'm the first guy shot, machine gun through the right side. I don't know if it was a machine gun bullet or a rifle bullet. It just went through my side, through the muscle. And then I stepped off into water over my head. Believe me, I wasn't counting ropes. I came out of that water, and I have my arms full of gear and stuff. The guys pulled me out. My platoon and I just rushed to the base of the cliff and grabbed any rope that we can get in our hands to get up that cliff. I couldn't tell you if there were my ropes, or F Company's ropes, or E Company's ropes. A movie should be made on the life of Len Lamel. An adoptee, Lamel had a wonderful upbringing in Point Pleasant, New Jersey. Once he joined the Army in 1942, he rose quickly in the ranks. Of medium height, well-built, with brown hair, blue eyes, and a slightly hooked nose, he was, as the cliché goes, a natural-born leader. Although he would vehemently deny it, perhaps more than any other 2nd Ranger Battalion soldier, his guts and cunning transformed a questionable outcome at Pointe Du Hoc into an unequivocal victory. It was all happenstance, he recalled in early 2005 from his home in Toms River, New Jersey. We were at the right place at the right time to really damage the enemy. Lamel rose to the occasion when Company D, having abandoned the right side, added the weight of their attack to the left side of the point. Despite his bullet wound, the sergeant climbed the cliffs. He made it to the top in good time. Once up there, he gathered his men and rushed the German pillboxes and bunkers. As historian Ronald Drez has noted, Lamel and company, worried about snipers, collectively embodied that character in a Bill Malden cartoon who quips, I feel like a fugitive from the law of averages. Scampering from hole to hole like prairie dogs eluding rattlesnakes, the small Lamel-led Ranger force advanced toward 3 casemated German gun positions on the right side, near where they were originally to have ascended the cliffs. When they got to their position, instead of having to attack heavily defended gun emplacements, the Rangers stared into empty pits and casemates. Wooden logs, decoys, had replaced the 155mm guns. Their luck had changed. The Germans, worried about air bombardment, had retreated and taken their menacing guns with them about 500 meters away. We didn't stop, Lamel recalled. We played it like a football game, charging hard and low. We went into the shell craters for protection because there were snipers around and machine guns firing at us. We'd wait for a moment, and if the fire lifted, we were out of that crater and into the next one. We ran as fast as we could over to the gun positions to take the one that we were assigned to. There were no guns in the positions. That's when Rudder's belief in Ranger initiative took over. Lamel continued. So we decided, well, they must have an alternate position somewhere. And we thought, we'll hear them. Maybe we'll see some evidence of the movement. But we never did hear them. The resourceful Lamel did not waste time lamenting the empty casemates. Since his primary mission to destroy the guns was not attainable, he immediately turned to his secondary mission, which was to interdict the coastal road that ran behind the point and join the German positions all the way from Grand Camp to Sword Beach at Oystrom. We never stopped, Lamel recalled. We kept firing and charging all the way through their buildings area, where they came out of their billets in states of undress. We were confronted with them there on our way up the road from the point to the coast road. Our orders were to set up a roadblock and keep the Germans from going to Omaha Beach. We were to also destroy all communications visible along the coast road. Lamel's 11 men from Company D were the first to reach the coastal road, which was blacktopped. They set up roadblocks both left and right, but they were hardly in position when the terrifying sound of Nazi marching boots was heard headed in their direction. Quickly, the small Ranger force ducked for cover as a 40 to 50-man German patrol appeared, heading toward Omaha. Peering out from the shrubs, the far outnumbered Rangers let the Nazi soldiers pass. The Germans turned into a field and faded from sight, and the Rangers reset their roadblock. They were a heavily armed group of Germans, Lamel recalled. We hid and said, "Let 'em go." Throughout Ranger training, Lamel's best friend was Sergeant Jack Kuhn, who hailed from Pennsylvania. Fascinated with all things military since childhood, when he turned 16, Kuhn signed up for the Citizens Military Training Camp at Fort Meade, Maryland. A big career setback occurred when the Marines refused to enlist him due to color blindness. He abandoned hopes of a military career and got a job working for an Altoona-based railroad company. But Pearl Harbor reawakened his desire to serve in uniform. In May 1942, he enlisted in the Army. Infatuated by the movie Northwest Passage, Kuhn made joining the elite Ranger Volunteer Service his #1 goal. Now, with Lamel at his side, he was liberating Europe. It wasn't a popcorn movie. They were playing for the highest stakes of all, life and death. He was a real hard-charging Ranger, Lamel recalled. Along with Harold Duke Slater, he could really climb those ropes. We used to call them Batman and Robin. So now Lamel and Kuhn, like Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, found themselves not just up the cliffs, but wandering around enemy territory. They trotted a short distance along the coast road to the right of the intersection. Before long, they found an obscure, narrow country lane. They saw equipment tracks imprinted in the dirt, a clear sign that heavy machinery or loaded wagons had recently passed by. And so Jack and I went down this sunken road not knowing where the hell it was going, but it was going inland, Lamel recalled. And we came upon this vale, or this little draw with camouflage all over it. Lo and behold, I peeked over this, just pure luck, over this hedgerow, and there were the guns, all sitting in proper firing condition, the ammunition piled up neatly, everything at the ready. But they were pointed at Utah Beach. They weren't pointed at Omaha Beach. Sergeant Lamel lay in the hedges for several moments looking at the 5 abandoned German guns next to an apple orchard, his mind frantically racing. There they were, the guns of Pointe Du Hoc, sitting unguarded in a field. He did, however, see a group of about 100 Nazi soldiers in the far corner of the field, looking as if they were having an impromptu strategy meeting. Lamel, realizing that hesitation wasn't an option, saw his chance to wreak havoc, to destroy the 5 German guns that had been moved from Pointe Du Hoc and were now at his reach. The 6th gun had been decommissioned in a prior air raid. I said, "Jack, you cover me. I'm going in there and destroy them." So all I had was 2 thermite grenades. I went in, he covered me. I said, "Keep your eyes on these people. I won't know if anybody comes, and you keep your eyes open." A paradoxically brazen but cautious Lamel crept from his hidden position in the tall hedgerow line and slipped into the field, one eye on the guns, the other on the German soldiers only 75 or 100 yards away. With the steady hands of a safecracker, Lamel put one of his 2 thermite grenades into the elevating and traversing mechanisms of the camouflaged German gun closest to him. He then crawled to the second one and repeated the process. He pulled the pins and crept back to the hedgerow just as the thermite grenades, which resembled soup cans, silently ignited. He had decommissioned 2 out of the 5. There were no craters around the apple orchard, Lamel recalled, so he knew that the Germans, before we came around, had successfully hidden the guns. Officially known as AN-M14TH3 incendiary grenades, these thermite grenades were created so GIs could easily destroy enemy equipment. When placed on metal, as Lamel had done, these pyrotechnic devices generated 4,000 Fahrenheit of heat for 30 to 45 seconds and burned straight through steel. The white-hot heat soon melted the metal of the mechanisms and rendered the guns immovable. They could still be fired, but only in their locked positions. The Germans never turned or moved from their position in the far corner of the field. There's no noise to a thermite grenade that could be heard 100 yards away, Lamel recalled. These grenades were used especially for this sort of job because they melted gears in the mechanism. But then we ran back to the road, which was 100 yards or so back, and got all the other thermite grenades from the remainder of our guys. So we stuffed our jackets and we rushed back, and we put the thermite grenades, as many as we could, in traversing mechanisms and elevation mechanisms and ganged the sights. Lamel again left the field, the unaware German still conferring. Breathless, he joined Kuhn, who was diligently guarding the approaches. After rendering the 5 guns useless, the 2 Rangers started to leave the scene of the crime, but a gigantic explosion dropped them to their faces. Thinking it was a short round from the Texas or the dreaded 6th gun, they scrambled to their feet and sprinted back to the road. Later they would learn that the earth-shaking boom had been the destruction of a Nazi ammo dump by another Ranger patrol. After a rocky start, everything was working out in the Rangers' favor. With the covert actions of Sergeants Lamel and Kuhn, the dreaded guns of Pointe Du Hoc were now neutralized. Mission accomplished. It was not quite 8:30 a.m. The cliffs had been scaled, the road between Omaha and Utah beaches had been interdicted, the big guns had been put out of action, and Company D had been successful in warding off ferocious attacks from German infantry. The company had become the first American unit to achieve its D-Day objectives. For their actions, Lamel received the Distinguished Service Cross, and Kuhn was awarded the Silver Star. 2 of Rudder's Rangers had become legends. We went out to the cliffs at Pointe Du Hoc, and when we got a look at what they had been going through for 3 days, it was a seesaw battle, Ranger Jack Keating later recalled. They'd push inland and then get pushed back, almost into the sea again off the cliffs, and it was touch and go for 3 days. Our colonel, Colonel James E. Rudder from Texas, one of the greatest men that ever lived, military, was hit twice on D-Day and refused to be evacuated. Officially, the Battle of Pointe Du Hoc was won on June 8th, when the American flag was raised on the promontory and a bugler played sorrowful notes. A sad reality of victorious Allied action was that while the Rangers were ultra-brave, they were not, like comic book superheroes, bulletproof. They had endured a horrific 70% casualty rate, yet their mission had been a military success. The surviving Rangers spent the rest of June, for the most part, guarding captured German prisoners and burying their dead friends. Many then went on to fight in the Battle of the Bulge. Lamel, for example, was wounded 3 times after D-Day as the Allies pressed their way east into Germany.